When historians compile the list of the deadliest submarines of World War II, one name consistently appears at or near the top: USS Rasher, credited with nearly 100,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed. But there's another submarine, one that, by certain measures, actually exceeded that total. A submarine that sank more tonnage in fewer patrols, with greater efficiency, and with kills that included not just merchant ships, but Japanese warships. Her name was USS Flasher, and according to post-war U.S. Navy accounting, she was credited with sinking 100,231 tons of enemy shipping, making her, by this measure, the highest-scoring American submarine of the Pacific War. The numbers tell a story of almost unbelievable efficiency. 21 confirmed ships sunk, 100,000 tons destroyed, and she did it all in just 6 war patrols, fewer than most other high-scoring submarines. While other legendary boats needed 10, 12, even 14 patrols to compile their records, Flasher achieved hers in half the time. But what truly set Flasher apart was the nature of her kills. She didn't just hunt the slow, defenseless merchant ships that made up most submarine targets. She went after warships, destroyers and escort vessels that were themselves designed to hunt and kill submarines. On one patrol alone, Flasher sank 2 Japanese destroyers. These were the most dangerous targets a submarine could choose: fast, maneuverable, heavily armed ships whose sole mission was to find and destroy boats like Flasher. She killed them anyway. Behind these statistics were men who understood that every patrol might be their last. The crew of Flasher lived for weeks at a time in a steel tube 300 feet long and 27 feet wide, breathing recycled air, eating food that grew less appetizing with each passing day, never knowing when the next depth charge might be the one that crushed their hull. She served under 2 exceptional commanding officers, Reuben Whitaker and George Grider, both of whom would become legends in the submarine service. Each brought a different style to the boat, but both shared an absolute commitment to one goal: sink enemy ships and bring their crew home alive. So why isn't USS Flasher a household name? Why does Rasher get the headlines while Flasher remains in the shadows? The answer lies in the complex history of how submarine records were calculated, recalculated, and debated in the decades after the war. But the men who served on Flasher knew the truth. They had been there. They had fired the torpedoes, heard the explosions, felt the depth charges falling around them. They knew what they had accomplished. This is the story of USS Flasher, from her commissioning in September 1943 to her final patrol in the spring of 1945, the complete history of the submarine that, by certain measures, sank more enemy tonnage than any other American boat in World War II. USS Flasher was built at the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, the premier submarine construction facility in the United States. Unlike some of her sister boats that were built at inland shipyards like Manitowoc, Flasher was constructed by craftsmen who had been building submarines for decades. Her keel was laid on January 8, 1943, at the height of the Pacific War. By this point, American submarines had already proven their worth, sinking hundreds of Japanese ships and slowly strangling the Empire's supply lines. But the demand for more boats was insatiable. The Navy wanted every submarine it could get. Flasher was a Gato-class submarine, the workhorse of the American submarine fleet. 311 feet long, displacing over 2,000 tons submerged, armed with 10 torpedo tubes and 24 torpedoes, she was virtually identical to dozens of other boats rolling off American shipways. But submarines are not made legendary by their specifications. They are made legendary by the men who command them and the crews who serve aboard them. Flasher was named after a species of fish found in the waters of the Atlantic, part of the U.S. Navy tradition of giving submarines sea creature names. Like so many submarine names, it was unassuming, even forgettable. No one could have predicted that this name would one day top the list of submarine achievements. She was launched on June 20th, 1943, and commissioned on September 25th of that year. Her first commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Reuben Thornton Whitaker, a man who would prove to be one of the most skilled submarine captains of the war. Whitaker was 31 years old when he took command of Flasher, young for a submarine captain, but already a veteran of the Pacific War. He had served as executive officer on another boat, learning the trade from experienced commanders before being given his own command. Those who served under Whitaker described him as calm, calculating, and absolutely fearless. He had an almost preternatural ability to read tactical situations, to anticipate enemy movements, to position his boat for the perfect shot. But more than that, he had the nerve to hold his fire until the last possible moment, closing to ranges that other captains considered suicidal. Whitaker believed in getting close, one of his officers later recalled, close enough to count the rivets on the target's hull. He said torpedoes were too valuable to waste, and he meant it. This philosophy would define Flasher's early patrols and establish the pattern of efficiency that would make her famous. After commissioning, Flasher underwent an intensive period of training and shakedown operations along the Atlantic coast. Whitaker drilled his crew mercilessly, running attack simulations day and night, practicing dive procedures until they could be executed in total darkness, rehearsing damage control scenarios until every man knew exactly what to do when the depth charges started falling. The crew was a mix of experienced submariners and newcomers. Some had already served on other boats, surviving patrols in the dangerous waters of the Pacific. Others were fresh from submarine school, their heads full of theory, but their hands untested by combat. Whitaker welded them into a single unit. He ran endless drills, criticized every mistake, demanded perfection in every procedure. Some men resented his relentless standards. Others recognized that those standards might save their lives. In late 1943, Flasher departed the Atlantic coast for the Pacific. She transited the Panama Canal, that narrow passage connecting two oceans, and emerged into the vast waters where the war against Japan was being fought. Her destination was Fremantle, Australia, one of the major submarine bases in the Southwest Pacific. From Fremantle, American submarines could reach the critical shipping lanes that connected Japan to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the resources of Southeast Asia. These were the richest hunting grounds in the Pacific and the most dangerous. Japanese escorts patrolled these waters constantly, and aircraft ranged overhead during daylight hours. Submarines that operated here faced daily threats from surface ships, aircraft, and mines. Whitaker had studied the patrol reports of other submarines, learning from their successes and their failures. He knew that the waters around the South China Sea and the Indochina coast were thick with Japanese shipping. He knew that convoys moved through these waters regularly, carrying oil, rubber, tin, and other vital materials. He intended to find those convoys, and he intended to destroy them. On January 6, 1944, USS Flasher departed Fremantle for her first war patrol. Her assigned area was the South China Sea, specifically the waters between Indochina and the Philippine Islands. The crew was nervous but confident. They had trained hard under Whitaker's demanding supervision. They trusted their captain and their boat. But no amount of training could fully prepare a man for the reality of combat. The waiting, the tension, the sudden violence, and the ever-present knowledge that death could come at any moment. As Australia disappeared below the horizon, Whitaker addressed his crew over the ship's intercom. "We are going into enemy waters. Our job is simple. Find Japanese ships and sink them. Every ship we destroy is a ship that cannot carry supplies to the enemy. Every tanker we sink is fuel that will never reach Japanese aircraft or warships." He paused. I expect every man to do his duty. In return, I will do everything in my power to bring you home safely. But make no mistake, we are going into harm's way. Be ready." The first patrol of USS Flasher was about to begin. The first war patrol of USS Flasher established her as a submarine to watch. In the waters of the South China Sea, Whitaker demonstrated the aggressive, close-range tactics that would become his signature. Flasher made her first contact with the enemy on January 25, 1944. A small Japanese convoy, 3 merchant ships escorted by 2 patrol vessels, appeared on radar shortly after midnight. Whitaker ordered a surface approach. In the darkness, Flasher was nearly invisible, just a low silhouette against the black water. The convoy was proceeding in standard formation, the escorts weaving back and forth ahead of the merchants. Most submarine captains would have been satisfied to pick off one of the stragglers, fire a spread of torpedoes at long range, then dive and escape. It was the safe play, the textbook approach. Whitaker had other ideas. He drove Flasher directly into the convoy, passing between the escorts and the merchant ships. It was an insanely aggressive move. If the escorts spotted them, Flasher would be trapped between multiple enemies with nowhere to run. But Whitaker's gamble paid off. At a range of less than 1,000 yards, he fired 4 torpedoes at the largest merchant ship in the convoy. 3 hit. The explosions lit up the night. The ship broke apart amidships, her bow and stern rising briefly before plunging beneath the waves. She sank in less than 2 minutes. Before the escorts could react, Whitaker swung Flasher around and fired 2 more torpedoes at a second merchant. Both hit. That ship was still sinking when Flasher slipped away into the darkness, leaving the convoy in chaos behind her. The first patrol continued for another 3 weeks. By the time Flasher returned to Fremantle in late February, she had sunk 4 confirmed ships totaling over 17,000 tons. It was an impressive debut, but what impressed Submarine Command most was not just the tonnage, it was the efficiency. Whitaker had fired fewer torpedoes per kill than almost any other captain. His close-range tactics, while dangerous, produced results that couldn't be argued with. The Navy noticed. Whitaker's patrol report was studied carefully, his tactics analyzed for lessons that could be applied across the submarine fleet. The second patrol would prove even more spectacular, and it would include targets that most submarine captains only dreamed of. Flasher departed Fremantle on April 14, 1944, again bound for the South China Sea. This time, Whitaker had more specific intelligence. Code breakers had identified a major Japanese convoy route running along the coast of Indochina, carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. For 3 weeks, Flasher prowled these waters, sinking smaller targets while waiting for the big prize. Whitaker was patient. He knew that the large tanker convoys came through regularly. He just had to wait. On May 4th, his patience was rewarded. Shortly before dawn, Flasher's radar detected a large formation approaching from the south. Whitaker brought the boat to periscope depth and raised the scope. What he saw was a submarine captain's dream, a convoy of 5 large tankers riding low in the water with full cargoes of oil, escorted by only 2 destroyers. The tankers were arranged in a loose column, their massive hulls silhouetted against the brightening sky. Whitaker began his approach. For 2 hours, Flasher maneuvered into position, staying ahead of the convoy while the sun rose and visibility increased. It was a dangerous game. In daylight, a periscope was much easier to spot, but Whitaker was determined to attack this convoy, regardless of the risk. At 0730, he fired. 6 torpedoes raced toward the lead tanker. 4 hit. The tanker, a large fleet oiler, exploded in a massive fireball as her cargo of aviation fuel ignited. The flames rose hundreds of feet into the morning sky, visible for miles in every direction. Before the escorts could organize a response, Whitaker had already turned toward the second tanker in line. 3 more torpedoes, 2 hits. That tanker didn't explode, but she stopped dead in the water, mortally wounded. The destroyers reacted immediately, charging toward the torpedo wakes at flank speed. Whitaker ordered Flasher deep, taking her below 200 feet as the escorts began their search. For the next 4 hours, Flasher endured one of the most intense depth charge attacks of her career. The destroyers were skilled and persistent, dropping pattern after pattern of depth charges around the submarine's position. Inside Flasher, the crew braced themselves as explosions rocked the boat. Light bulbs shattered, cork insulation rained down from the overhead. Gauges jumped wildly with each detonation, but the hull held. Whitaker remained calm throughout, maneuvering the boat with small, careful adjustments, listening to the sounds of the destroyer's propellers through the hull, predicting where the next attack would come. Finally, after 4 hours, the destroyers gave up. They had expended their depth charges without result. Flasher had survived. When she surfaced that night, the crew could see the glow of the burning tanker still visible on the horizon, 30 miles away. She would burn for another 2 days before finally sinking. The second patrol ended with 5 confirmed kills, totaling over 27,000 tons. Combined with her first patrol, Flasher had now sunk 9 ships, and she had barely begun. Whitaker received the Navy Cross for his actions on the second patrol. It was the second highest decoration for valor, and richly deserved. He had proven himself one of the finest submarine commanders in the Pacific. But after 2 patrols, Whitaker was due for a rest. The relentless stress of submarine command took its toll on even the strongest men. The Navy rotated commanding officers regularly, recognizing that exhausted captains made mistakes, and mistakes in submarines usually prove fatal. In July 1944, Lieutenant Commander George William Grider took command of USS Flasher. He would take her to even greater heights. The most destructive chapter of Flasher's career was about to begin. George Grider was a different kind of commander than Reuben Whitaker. Where Whitaker was quiet and calculating, Grider was more openly aggressive, willing to share his thinking with his crew and quick to seize opportunities that others might pass up. But both men shared the essential quality that made great submarine captains: absolute coolness under pressure. Grider was 30 years old when he took command of Flasher, young even by wartime standards. But he had already served on 3 other submarines, learning his trade in the hard school of Pacific combat. He had been executive officer on USS Wahoo under the legendary Dudley "Mush" Morton, witnessing some of the most aggressive submarine operations of the war. That experience had shaped Grider's approach to command. He believed in attacking at every opportunity, in pressing home attacks even when prudence suggested withdrawal, in making every patrol count. "We're here to sink ships," he told his officers shortly after taking command. "Every day we're at sea and not sinking something is a day wasted." August-September 1944. Flasher's third war patrol began on August 7, 1944. Her hunting ground was familiar territory, the South China Sea, with its rich shipping lanes connecting Japan to the resources of Southeast Asia. But this patrol would be different. Flasher would not be operating alone. She was assigned to a coordinated attack group with 2 other submarines, USS Creval and USS Angler. The Americans called these groups wolf packs, borrowing the German term, though American wolf pack tactics differed in important ways from their German counterparts. The 3 submarines would patrol the same general area, sharing intelligence on convoy movements and coordinating their attacks. In theory, this would allow them to overwhelm convoy defenses that might defeat a single submarine. On August 26th, the wolf pack found what it was looking for: a large convoy of 10 merchant ships escorted by 4 destroyers, moving north through the South China Sea. The 3 submarines coordinated their approach by radio, each taking a different position around the convoy. Grider placed Flasher ahead of the convoy's track, directly in its path. At 2200 hours, the attack began. What happened next would become one of the most celebrated single actions of Flasher's career. As Grider was positioning for an attack on the merchant ships, one of the escorting destroyers turned directly toward Flasher. Whether by chance or because she had detected the submarine, the destroyer was heading straight for them at high speed. Most submarine captains, faced with an attacking destroyer, would dive immediately and attempt to escape. A destroyer was the natural enemy of a submarine, faster, more maneuverable, armed with depth charges and deck guns that could tear a submarine apart. Grider chose to attack. He held his position as the destroyer closed, waiting until the range dropped below 1,000 yards, practically point blank for a torpedo attack. Then he fired 2 torpedoes and ordered an immediate crash dive. The torpedoes ran true. Both hit. The destroyer broke apart and sank in less than 90 seconds. Flasher had killed one of her own hunters. But Grider wasn't finished. Even as the destroyer was sinking, he was already turning Flasher toward the merchant ships. Over the next 2 hours, in a series of attacks that left the convoy in chaos, Flasher sank 3 more ships, 2 large tankers and a freighter. The other submarines in the Wolfpack added their own kills, but Flasher's total was the highest. By dawn, the convoy had been effectively destroyed. 6 ships sunk, others damaged, escorts scattered and demoralized. The third patrol produced 6 confirmed kills for Flasher alone, including the destroyer. Total tonnage exceeded 30,000 tons. It was one of the most successful patrols of any American submarine in the war. But Grider and his crew had no time to celebrate. Flasher returned to port, rearmed and resupplied, and headed back out for her 4th patrol. December 1944 to January 1945. The 4th patrol would prove to be Flasher's deadliest, and it would include an attack that demonstrated just how lethal a well-handled submarine could be. Operating again in the South China Sea, Flasher found the hunting even better than before. Japanese shipping was becoming increasingly concentrated in coastal waters, trying to avoid the American submarines that now ranged freely across the Pacific. This concentration made the convoys easier to find and easier to destroy. December 4th, 1944, the perfect attack. On December 4th, 1944, Flasher encountered a convoy of 4 ships, 2 tankers and 2 escorts, moving north along the coast of Indochina. What followed was one of the most efficient submarine attacks of the entire war. Grider maneuvered Flasher into a perfect position ahead of the convoy. As the ships approached, he fired 4 torpedoes, 1 at each target. 4 torpedoes, 4 ships, 4 hits. Both tankers were struck amidships and sank within minutes. One escort took a torpedo in her engine room and went down by the stern. The second escort was damaged so severely that she had to be abandoned. 4 ships destroyed with 4 torpedoes. It was textbook submarine warfare, executed with a precision that left nothing to chance. Later in the same patrol, Flasher encountered an even more challenging target. On December 22nd, Grider spotted a Japanese warship, a large vessel traveling with escort through the South China Sea. Major warships were rare targets for submarines. They were fast, well protected, and usually traveled with heavy escorts. Most submarine captains never even saw one, let alone had the opportunity to attack. Grider saw his chance and took it. The approach was difficult. The target was zigzagging constantly, making speed calculations nearly impossible. Her escorts were alert and aggressive, pinging with their sonar and dropping occasional depth charges to discourage any submarines in the area. Grider spent 3 hours maneuvering Flasher into position, constantly adjusting for the target's course changes, waiting for the perfect shot. At 15:32 hours, he fired 4 torpedoes. Hits were observed. The target was struck and left badly damaged, forced to limp away under escort. Whether she ultimately survived or sank, the attack had demonstrated Flasher's ability to engage even the most dangerous targets. The 4th Patrol produced 7 confirmed kills, including another destroyer. Total tonnage exceeded 40,000 tons. Combined with her previous patrols, Flasher had now sunk 20 ships, totaling over 90,000 tons. She was on pace to become the highest-scoring submarine in American history, and she still had 2 more patrols to go. The 5th War Patrol of USS Flasher began in February 1945. George Grider was still in command, but the war had changed dramatically since Flasher's first patrol just a year earlier. American forces were now deep into the Philippine Islands. Iwo Jima would soon fall, and the invasion of Okinawa was being planned. The Japanese Empire was crumbling, its navy shattered, its merchant fleet decimated by the relentless submarine campaign. For submarines like Flasher, this meant fewer targets, but also fewer places for those targets to hide. Japanese shipping was concentrated in coastal waters, hugging the shoreline in desperate attempts to avoid the American boats that now controlled the open ocean. Grider took Flasher into these dangerous coastal waters, hunting in areas where the water was often too shallow for safe diving, where Japanese aircraft could reach quickly, where mines posed a constant threat. The 5th Patrol was conducted in the waters around the Indochina coast in the Gulf of Siam. The hunting was thin compared to earlier patrols. The submarine campaign had simply been too successful. There weren't many targets left. But Flasher still found them. On March 5th, she encountered a small convoy of coastal vessels, not the large tankers and transports of earlier patrols, but still legitimate targets. Grider attacked with his characteristic precision, sinking 2 ships with minimal torpedo expenditure. Later in the patrol, Flasher added another freighter to her record, bringing her 5th patrol total to 3 ships sunk. After the 5th patrol, George Grider was transferred to other duties. Like Whitaker before him, he had earned a rest. 3 consecutive war patrols as commanding officer had taken their toll, and the Navy wanted to preserve his experience for training the next generation of submarine captains. Grider's record aboard Flasher was remarkable. 4 patrols, 14 ships sunk, over 60,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed. He had proven himself one of the finest submarine commanders of the war. His replacement was Lieutenant Commander Philip Tabor Glennon Jr., another experienced submarine officer who would command Flasher for her final patrol. Flasher's 6th and final war patrol began in April 1945. By now, the end of the war was clearly in sight. Germany had surrendered in May, and Japan was fighting alone against overwhelming Allied power. The hunting was even thinner than the 5th patrol. Japanese merchant shipping had been effectively destroyed. The submarine campaign had achieved its objective. American boats were now hunting for the scraps of an empire that had already been defeated at sea. Flasher patrolled the waters around the South China Sea for 6 weeks, finding few targets. She sank 1 more ship, a small coastal freighter, bringing her final total to 21 confirmed kills. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, USS Flasher was already back in port, her war patrols complete. The final statistics for USS Flasher tell the story of extraordinary achievement. 21 confirmed ships sunk, 100,231 tons of enemy shipping destroyed, according to post-war U.S. Navy accounting, the highest total credited to any American submarine of the war. But Flasher's record was remarkable not just for its size, but for its composition. Unlike most high-scoring submarines, which compiled their records primarily against slow, defenseless merchant ships, Flasher killed warships. Her victims included 2 destroyers and multiple armed escorts. These were not easy targets. These were ships designed to hunt and kill submarines, and Flasher had killed them instead. Perhaps even more impressive was Flasher's efficiency. She achieved her record in just 6 war patrols, fewer than most other high-scoring submarines. USS Rasher, often cited as the highest tonnage submarine, needed 8 patrols to compile her record. USS Silversides needed 14. USS Tang needed 5, but was lost on her 5th patrol before she could continue. Flasher completed her 6 patrols without losing a single crew member to enemy action. She survived depth charge attacks, aircraft attacks, and the constant dangers of operating in enemy-controlled waters. She came home every time. Why, then, isn't USS Flasher universally recognized as the highest-scoring submarine of the war? The answer lies in the complex and sometimes contradictory methods used to calculate submarine tonnage. Different sources use different methodologies: wartime claims versus post-war analysis, JANAC assessments versus other accounting systems. Depending on which method you use, different submarines appear at the top of the list. Some sources credit Rasher with higher tonnage, others credit Flasher. Still others point to USS Barb or USS Tang as having the most impressive records when other factors are considered. The men who served on these submarines didn't care much about the rankings. They knew what they had accomplished. They had done their duty, sunk enemy ships, and, most importantly, survived. But by the U.S. Navy's post-war accounting, Flasher stood at the top. 100,231 tons, the highest total credited to any American submarine. Flasher's success was a product of 2 exceptional commanding officers working with an outstanding crew. Reuben Whitaker established the pattern during the first 2 patrols: close-range attacks, careful torpedo economy, calculated aggression. His calm under pressure and tactical brilliance set the standard that defined the boat. George Grider built on that foundation, adding his own aggressive instincts and willingness to attack targets, like destroyers, that other captains might have avoided. His 4 patrols produced the bulk of Flasher's tonnage and included some of the most spectacular individual actions of the submarine war. Both men received the Navy Cross for their service aboard Flasher. Both went on to distinguished post-war careers. Grider would later write a memoir of his submarine experiences, Warfish, which became one of the classic accounts of the Pacific Submarine War. After the war, USS Flasher was decommissioned and placed in reserve. Unlike some submarines that were immediately scrapped, she was preserved as a potential reserve asset during the early years of the Cold War. In 1959, she was finally struck from the Naval Vessel Register and sold for scrapping. Unlike USS Silversides or USS Bowfin, Flasher was not preserved as a museum ship. No memorial marks her achievements. Her physical presence has been lost to history, but her record endures. In the archives of the U.S. Navy, her patrol reports survive. Detailed accounts of each attack, each kill, each depth charge endured. Historians continue to study these reports, analyzing the tactics that made Flasher so effective. And in the memories of the men who served aboard her and their descendants, USS Flasher remains what she was: one of the most effective weapons the United States deployed in the Pacific War. The submarine campaign that Flasher exemplified was one of the most successful military operations in history. American submarines, comprising less than 2% of Navy personnel, sank over 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping lost during the war. They sank over 200 warships. They effectively strangled the Japanese economy, cutting off the oil, rubber, metals, and food that the empire needed to survive. And they paid for it. 52 American submarines were lost during the war. Over 3,500 submariners never came home. It was one of the highest casualty rates of any branch of the American military. Flasher survived. She survived because of excellent leadership, outstanding crew performance, and perhaps a measure of luck that every combat veteran recognizes as essential to survival. She survived, and she compiled a record that, by certain measures, no other American submarine has ever matched. When we talk about the greatest submarines of World War II, certain names always appear: Rasher, Silversides, Tang, Barb, Wahoo. These boats and their commanders have become legends, their stories told and retold in books and documentaries. USS Flasher deserves to stand among them. Not just because of her tonnage record, though that record by certain measures tops them all. Not just because of her efficiency, though sinking 21 ships in just 6 patrols remains remarkable. Not just because she killed warships that were supposed to kill her, but because Flasher represents everything that made the American submarine campaign successful. She was a standard fleet boat, identical in design to dozens of others. What made her special was not her machinery or her weapons, but the men who served aboard her and the way they used the tools they were given. Reuben Whitaker and George Grider didn't have secret weapons or superior technology. They had training, determination, and the courage to close with the enemy at ranges that other captains considered suicidal. They had crews who performed their duties flawlessly under conditions of extreme stress. They had the skill to find the enemy and the nerve to attack. 21 ships sunk, 100,000 tons destroyed. Numbers that represent more than statistics. Each ship Flasher destroyed was a ship that never delivered its cargo. Each tanker she sank was oil that never reached Japanese aircraft or warships. Each transport she torpedoed was troops or supplies that never reached their destination. In the calculus of total war, Flasher was one of the most valuable weapons the United States possessed. A single submarine, operating over 18 months, inflicted damage on the Japanese war effort that would have required entire air wings or surface task forces to match. And behind those numbers were 70 men who lived, worked, fought, and survived together in a steel tube 300 feet long. They spent weeks at a time submerged in enemy waters, breathing recycled air, eating food that grew stale, sleeping in bunks stacked 3 high. They endured depth-charge attacks that could have crushed their hull at any moment. They fired torpedoes at ships that were trying to kill them. They did their duty, and they came home. USS Flasher may never achieve the popular recognition of some of her sister submarines. There is no museum ship, no memorial, no movie about her exploits. She exists only in the records, in the memories of those who served aboard her, and in the history of the submarine war that helped win the Pacific. But for those who study that history carefully, who look beyond the headlines to the statistics and the patrol reports, one fact becomes clear. By one of the most widely used measures, tonnage of enemy shipping destroyed, USS Flasher stands at the very top. 21 ships, 6 patrols, 100,231 tons, 2 destroyers, multiple escorts. The submarine that topped them all. This has been the story of USS Flasher, the submarine that, by certain measures, sank more enemy tonnage than any other American boat in World War II. May the men who served aboard her never be forgotten.